July 25, 1944. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin crouched behind his Sherman tank in a Norman hedgerow, listening to the distinctive whine of German machine gun fire cutting through the morning air. For 7 weeks, the U.S. Army had been trapped in this green hell of ancient hedgerows, losing hundreds of tanks and thousands of men to an enemy who had turned every field into a fortress. The bocage country of Normandy was bleeding America white. Every hedgerow was a tank trap. Every field was a killing ground. German defenders could destroy Sherman after Sherman with Panzerfausts and hidden anti-tank guns while remaining completely invisible in the thick vegetation. Culin wiped the sweat from his forehead and stared at the twisted steel lying scattered around his position. Rommel's Atlantic Wall, the massive steel obstacles the Germans had placed on the beaches to stop landing craft, now littered the Normandy countryside, abandoned after the successful D-Day landings. An idea began forming in the sergeant's mind, an idea so simple, so obvious, that it would revolutionize armored warfare and break the bloody stalemate that was destroying the American advance. What if they could use Rommel's own steel against him? Culin picked up a piece of the German beach obstacle, twisted steel designed to rip the bottom out of Allied landing craft. He held it up against his tank's hull, mentally calculating angles and stress points. The steel was strong enough to punch through concrete. Maybe it was strong enough to punch through hedgerows. Within days, Culin's improvised invention would transform the Normandy campaign. His Rhino tanks would smash through Hitler's Green Fortress like it was made of paper. The sergeant from New Jersey was about to hand the U.S. Army the key to breaking out of the bocage. But first, he had to convince his officers that a tank mechanic had solved a problem that had stumped the entire American high command. This is the story of how one sergeant's ingenuity turned defeat into victory, how American innovation triumphed over German engineering, and how the tools of Hitler's Atlantic Wall became the weapons that destroyed it. The crisis began 6 weeks earlier, when American armor met an enemy it couldn't defeat. June 13, 1944. 1 week after D-Day, American forces pushing inland from Omaha Beach encountered their first Norman hedgerow. What they found was unlike anything in their training manuals or tactical doctrine. The bocage hedgerows were ancient, some over 1,000 years old. Thick earthen embankments topped with dense vegetation, they divided the Norman countryside into thousands of small fields, like a giant checkerboard. Each hedgerow was 8 to 12 feet high, thick enough to stop a tank, and dense enough to hide an army. To American tankers who had trained on the open plains of Louisiana and Texas, the bocage was an alien landscape. Visibility was measured in yards rather than miles. Tank commanders couldn't see their objectives, their supporting units, or the enemy waiting in ambush. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, reported to division headquarters. These hedgerows are perfect defensive positions. The enemy can position anti-tank weapons with complete concealment while our tanks are forced to advance blind into prepared kill zones. American tactical doctrine assumed that tanks would fight on open ground, where their speed, firepower, and armor could dominate the battlefield. The bocage negated every American advantage while maximizing every German strength. The Germans had spent 4 years fortifying Normandy. They knew exactly how to use the hedgerows. Machine gun nests were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Anti-tank guns were sighted to catch American armor in flanking positions. Mortars were pre-registered on every gap where tanks might attempt to break through. Most deadly of all, German infantry armed with Panzerfausts could approach American tanks through the thick vegetation and destroy them at point-blank range. Sherman crews never saw the enemy who killed them. The bocage had turned Normandy into the world's largest anti-tank obstacle. June 19, 1944. American losses mounted with horrifying regularity. The 2nd Armored Division lost 23 tanks in a single day, attempting to advance through hedgerow country. The 4th Infantry Division reported that entire companies were being wiped out trying to clear single fields. Major General Leonard Hedgerow, commanding V Corps, sent an urgent message to General Bradley. Current tactics are resulting in prohibitive casualties with minimal territorial gains. The bocage presents tactical problems for which we have no adequate solution. American commanders tried everything they could think of. Artillery bombardments that pulverized the countryside but left the hedgerows intact. Infantry assaults that cost hundreds of casualties to take single fields. Tank attacks that ended with burning Shermans and dead crews. The most common approach was for infantry to advance through gaps in the hedgerows while tanks provided covering fire. But the gaps were killing grounds where German machine gunners cut down American soldiers like wheat. The few tanks that made it through gaps found themselves isolated in small fields, surrounded by hidden anti-tank weapons. Tank crews developed their own techniques for hedgerow fighting, none of them successful. Some tried to climb over the hedgerows, exposing their vulnerable belly armor to hidden Panzerfausts. Others attempted to blast through with high-explosive shells, creating gaps that German defenders could easily cover with concentrated fire. The most desperate crews tried ramming through the hedgerows at full speed. The results were predictable: damaged tanks, injured crews, and German anti-tank rounds punching through Sherman armor at point-blank range. By late June, American tank losses in Normandy were approaching 50% in some units. The bocage was devouring the Allied armored advantage and turning the liberation of France into a bloody war of attrition. Something had to change, or the Normandy campaign would become another World War I stalemate. June 29, 1944. Sergeant Curtis Culin was not a typical tank commander. A mechanic by trade before the war, he understood machinery better than military tactics. While other sergeants focused on gunnery and movement, Culin studied the mechanical problems that kept tanks from accomplishing their missions. The hedgerow problem was, fundamentally, a mechanical challenge. How do you move a 30-ton tank through an obstacle designed to stop tanks? Traditional approaches, climbing over, blasting through, finding gaps, all failed because they played to German defensive advantages. Culin began thinking like a mechanic rather than a soldier. What if, instead of going over or around the hedgerows, they could cut straight through them? The idea wasn't new. American engineers had experimented with bulldozer blades mounted on tanks, but bulldozer blades were designed to push earth, not cut through thick vegetation and roots that had been growing for centuries. Culin needed something sharper, something designed to cut rather than push, something that could slice through hedgerows like a knife through butter. Walking through the debris scattered around the Norman countryside, Culin found his answer lying in the abandoned German beach obstacles. The Belgierate Hinderness, Belgian gates, were massive steel obstacles that Rommel had placed on the beaches to rip apart Allied landing craft. They consisted of sharp steel angles designed to puncture and tear. They were made of hardened steel that could punch through boat hulls and tank armor. What if that same cutting power could be turned against the hedgerows? July 2nd, 1944. Culin began experimenting with mounting pieces of German beach obstacles on the front of his Sherman tank. Using cutting torches and welding equipment from the maintenance section, he fabricated crude but functional cutting blades. The first prototype looked like medieval siege equipment welded to a modern tank. 4 steel prongs jutted forward from the Sherman's hull, angled downward to bite into the earth at the base of hedgerows. The steel came from Rommel's own beach obstacles, twisted into American innovation. Culin's fellow tank crews were skeptical. "Looks like something out of a junkyard," commented Sergeant Robert Reardon. "You sure that contraption won't fall apart the first time you hit a hedgerow?" Culin was confident in his engineering. The German steel was high quality, designed to withstand the impact of landing craft traveling at 20 knots. It could certainly handle the relatively slow impact of a tank moving at hedgerow clearing speed. The real question was whether the concept would work tactically. Could a tank equipped with hedgerow cutters break through German defensive positions quickly enough to avoid concentrated enemy fire? There was only one way to find out. July 5, 1944. Cullin's first field test took place near St. Vith, where the 102nd Cavalry Squadron was preparing to attack German positions across a series of heavily defended hedgerows. Culin volunteered his modified Sherman to spearhead the assault. The attack began at dawn with a brief artillery preparation designed to keep German defenders' heads down during the initial breakthrough. As the barrage lifted, Culin's Sherman rumbled toward the first hedgerow at a steady 15 miles per hour. German machine gunners opened fire immediately, their bullets sparking off the Sherman's armor and the improvised steel cutters. Culin could hear the distinctive crack of Panzerfaust rounds being fired from concealed positions, but the German anti-tank teams were aiming at where they expected the tank to stop, at the base of the hedgerow. Instead, Culin drove straight into the obstacle. The German steel blades bit deep into the earthen embankment, cutting through roots and vegetation that had stopped previous American attacks. The Sherman's engine roared as Culin applied full power, pushing through resistance that would have stopped a conventional tank. In 30 seconds, Culin's Sherman emerged on the far side of the hedgerow, surprising German defenders who were positioned to fight tanks approaching through traditional gaps. Before the Germans could reposition their weapons, American infantry poured through the hole Culin had created. The breakthrough was complete. For the first time in the Normandy campaign, American armor had punched through bocage defenses without prohibitive losses. Word of Culin's success spread through American units like wildfire. July 10, 1944. Within days, every American tank unit in Normandy was demanding hedgerow cutters. Maintenance sections worked around the clock, welding German beach obstacles onto Sherman holes and creating the improvised weapons that would break the bocage stalemate. Colonel Sidney Hines, commanding Combat Command B of the 2nd Armored Division, reported to General Bradley, "Sergeant Culin's hedgerow device has revolutionized bocage tactics. We can now advance through defensive positions that previously required days of preparation and hundreds of casualties." The Culin cutters, or Rhino tanks, transformed American tactical capabilities overnight. Tank units that had been losing 30% of their strength to hedgerow fighting suddenly found themselves advancing with minimal losses. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantage. American tank crews who had spent weeks watching their friends die in burning Shermans suddenly felt confident attacking positions that had seemed impregnable. German defenders who had grown used to slaughtering American armor with hidden anti-tank weapons found their positions being overrun before they could react. Lieutenant Robert Bradley, 3rd Armored Division, described the change. "Before the Culin cutters, attacking through bocage was suicide. We knew we'd lose half our tanks taking a single field. After Culin showed us how to cut through the hedgerows, we started thinking like an armored division again instead of like sacrificial lambs." The invention was spreading throughout the American forces in Normandy, but it remained an improvised solution created by individual units. What the Army needed was mass production and systematic implementation. That would require the attention of higher command. July 18, 1944. General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army, personally witnessed a demonstration of Culin's hedgerow cutters during a visit to the 2nd Armored Division. What he saw convinced him that this sergeant's invention could change the entire Normandy campaign. Bradley watched as a company of Rhino tanks smashed through 3 successive hedgerows in under 10 minutes, an advance that would have taken hours using conventional tactics and cost dozens of casualties. German defenders, positioned to fight tanks approaching through gaps, were overwhelmed by armor that appeared behind them after cutting through supposedly impenetrable obstacles. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," Bradley told his staff. "We need to equip every tank in the theater with these devices immediately." Bradley ordered the establishment of rhinoceros production facilities using captured German steel and American welding equipment. Priority was given to units preparing for Operation Cobra, the massive offensive designed to break American forces out of the Normandy bocage and begin the race across France. The irony was perfect. Rommel's Atlantic Wall, designed to stop the Allied invasion, was being turned into the weapon that would destroy German defenses in Normandy. July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra began with the largest tactical air bombardment in history, 1,500 heavy bombers dropping 3,300 tons of explosives on German positions south of St. Lo. But the real breakthrough came when American armor equipped with Culin cutters smashed through German defensive lines that had held for 7 weeks. The 7th Corps attacked with over 750 tanks, 60% of them equipped with Rhino devices. Instead of being channeled through prepared killing grounds, American armor cut new paths through the bocage, appearing in German rear areas and overwhelming defensive positions from unexpected directions. German resistance, organized around controlling traditional routes of advance, collapsed when faced with American tanks that could create their own routes. Defensive positions carefully sited to cover hedgerow gaps became useless when American armor cut through the hedgerows themselves. By evening, American spearheads had advanced further in one day than they had in the previous 7 weeks. The bocage stalemate was broken. The breakout from Normandy had begun. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps, radioed Bradley. Rhino tanks have achieved complete tactical surprise. German defenses designed to stop conventional armor attacks are proving ineffective against hedgerow cutting capabilities. The breakthrough continued for days as American armor raced across Norman countryside that had been impassable weeks earlier. German forces, caught completely off guard by American tactical innovation, fell back in disorder toward the Seine River. August 1, 1944. Within a week of Operation Cobra's launch, American forces had broken completely free of the bocage and were advancing across open French countryside toward Paris. The campaign that had seemed destined to become another World War I stalemate had been transformed into a war of movement that played to every American strength. German commanders struggled to understand what had happened. General Heinrich Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, reported to Berlin. Enemy armored tactics have changed completely. American tanks are no longer restricted to prepared routes of advance. They are cutting through our defensive obstacles and appearing in unexpected locations throughout our rear areas. What Eberbach didn't know was that his own commander's defensive preparations had provided the Americans with their breakthrough weapon. The steel obstacles that Rommel had so carefully positioned on the Atlantic beaches were now mounted on American tanks, cutting through the very hedgerows that German engineers had counted on to stop Allied armor. Sergeant Curtis Culin had turned Rommel's greatest defensive asset into his greatest vulnerability. The impact of Culin's invention extended far beyond the Normandy campaign. American forces equipped with hedgerow cutters would use similar tactics to break through the Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine, and advance into the heart of Germany. The principle of using improvised cutting devices to overcome defensive obstacles became standard American doctrine for the rest of the war. August 15, 1944. 3 weeks after Operation Cobra, American and British forces completed the encirclement of German Army Group B in the Falaise Pocket. Over 50,000 German soldiers were killed or captured, along with most of their equipment. The German army in Normandy had been effectively destroyed. The victory was made possible by American armor that could advance across terrain the Germans had considered impassable. Hedgerow cutters had given American forces the mobility to exploit tactical breakthroughs and turn local successes into strategic victories. General Bradley later wrote, Sergeant Culin's hedgerow device was as important to winning the Normandy campaign as any strategic decision made by higher command. His innovation broke the bocage stalemate and restored American armor to its proper role in mobile warfare. The recognition was deserved, but came slowly. While generals received credit for the Normandy breakout, the sergeant whose invention made it possible remained largely unknown outside his own unit. Curtis Culin never sought publicity for his contribution to Allied victory. He was a mechanic who had solved a mechanical problem, then returned to his regular duties maintaining tanks and training crews. The war moved on, and Culin moved with it, continuing to serve as a maintenance sergeant until Germany surrendered. But his impact on the war was enormous. By July 1944, Over 500 American tanks had been equipped with Culin cutters. These Rhino tanks spearheaded every major American advance from Normandy to the Rhine, breaking through defensive positions that conventional tactics couldn't overcome. The invention's success lay in its simplicity. Instead of developing complex new weapons or tactics, Culin had identified the core problem, Hedgerows stopping tank movement, and created a direct mechanical solution. The cutting blades didn't require special training, elaborate maintenance, or complex logistics. Any tank crew could use them effectively. Most importantly, Culin had recognized that the enemy's own materials could be turned against him. The German beach obstacles that had failed to stop the D-Day landings found new life as American tank equipment, cutting through Hitler's Green Fortress with the efficiency that Rommel had originally intended to use against Allied landing craft. September 15th, 1944. As American forces crossed the German border and began fighting on Reich territory, Curtis Culin was promoted to technical sergeant and awarded the Bronze Star for his contribution to Allied victory. The citation read, "For meritorious service in developing equipment modifications that significantly enhanced American tactical capabilities during the Normandy campaign." It was a modest recognition for an invention that had changed the course of the war. Culin's story exemplified everything that made the American military effective in World War II. The willingness to innovate, the ability to improvise solutions under pressure, and the understanding that good ideas could come from any rank or background. The sergeant from New Jersey had proven that American ingenuity was as valuable as American industrial production. When faced with a tactical problem that stumped the high command, a tank mechanic had found the answer by thinking like an engineer rather than a soldier. His hedgerow cutters became a symbol of American adaptability, the ability to identify problems, develop solutions, and implement changes faster than the enemy could adapt. It was exactly the kind of innovation that won wars. In the end, Curtis Culin had done more than solve a tactical problem. He had demonstrated that American forces could turn any situation to their advantage, using the enemy's own weapons against him and transforming defensive obstacles into offensive capabilities. The bocage hedgerows that were supposed to stop American armor became the testing ground for American innovation. Rommel's beach obstacles, designed to prevent Allied landings, became the tools that broke through Hitler's Norman fortress. Sergeant Culin had proven that in war, as in mechanics, there was always a solution. Sometimes it just took a mechanic to find it. An idea began forming in the sergeant's mind, an idea so simple, so obvious, that it would revolutionize armored warfare and break the bloody stalemate that was destroying the American advance. What if they could use Rommel's own steel against him? Culin picked up a piece of the German beach obstacle, twisted steel designed to rip the bottom out of Allied landing craft. He held it up against his tank's hull, mentally calculating angles and stress points. The steel was strong enough to punch through concrete. Maybe it was strong enough to punch through hedgerows. Within days, Culin's improvised invention would transform the Normandy campaign. His Rhino tanks would smash through Hitler's Green Fortress like it was made of paper. The sergeant from New Jersey was about to hand the U.S. Army the key to breaking out of the bocage. But first, he had to convince his officers that a tank mechanic had solved a problem that had stumped the entire American high command.